The rain fell in sheets over Arlington Memorial Cemetery, but Thomas "Ghost" Mercer didn't move. He never moved, not when it rained, not when it snowed, not when the summer sun beat down so hard the grass turned brown. Every Sunday morning at exactly 7 o'clock, he stood before the small headstone in the military section, his broad shoulders hunched against whatever weather the Virginia sky decided to throw at him. The stone read, "Ethan James Mercer, beloved son, 1995-2014, gone too soon." Thomas traced the letters with his calloused fingers, the same way he'd done every week for 10 years. His hand was steady, a Navy SEAL's hand, trained to be steady even when everything inside was falling apart. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice rough. "It's Dad. I brought you something." He pulled a small model airplane from his jacket pocket, a replica of an F-18 painted in navy blue. Ethan had loved planes, had dreamed of being a pilot someday, had spent hours in his room building models, hanging them from the ceiling until the whole room looked like an air show frozen in time. "Found this at that hobby shop downtown, the one we used to go to on Saturdays, remember? Old Mr. Patterson finally retired. His grandson runs it now. Nice kid. Reminds me of you." Thomas remembered the day he'd helped Ethan build his first model. The boy had been 8, his small hands struggling with the tiny pieces, glue getting everywhere except where it was supposed to go. Thomas had been home on leave for 2 weeks, a rare gift, and they'd spent an entire Saturday afternoon at the kitchen table, assembling a P-51 Mustang piece by piece. "Dad, this is taking forever," Ethan had complained. "Good things take time, buddy. The best things always do. But I want to see it fly." Thomas had laughed and ruffled his son's hair. "It won't really fly. It's a model." "I know that, but I want to pretend. I want to hold it up and run around and pretend it's real." And he had. For hours after they'd finished, Ethan had raced through the house, holding the Mustang above his head, making engine noises that drove Sarah crazy, but made Thomas's heart swell with joy. That had been one of the good days, one of the days Thomas held on to now, when the darkness threatened to swallow him whole. Thomas placed the model at the base of the headstone, next to the weathered collection of previous offerings. A baseball, a worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea, a faded photograph of the two of them at Ethan's high school graduation, just 3 months before the accident. The accident. Even after a decade, Thomas couldn't bring himself to call it anything else. Couldn't say the words car crash or drunk driver or dead on impact. Couldn't relive that night when 2 police officers had shown up at his door, their faces arranged in that careful expression of professional sympathy, and destroyed his entire world with a single sentence. "Mr. Mercer, we're sorry to inform you." He'd been on deployment when it happened, somewhere in a country he still couldn't name, doing things he'd never be able to talk about. By the time he got stateside, Ethan had already been buried. Sarah, his ex-wife, had made all the arrangements. She'd chosen the casket, the flowers, the plot. She'd stood alone at the funeral because Thomas was 8,000 miles away, unable to get emergency leave approved in time. He'd never forgiven himself for that. Never forgiven the Navy, or the mission, or the bureaucratic red tape that had kept him from saying goodbye to his only son. He remembered getting the news, standing in the communications tent, the satellite phone pressed against his ear, the commander's voice tinny and distant. "Mercer, you need to come home. There's been an accident. Your son." Thomas had dropped to his knees right there in front of his entire team, men who had seen him take a bullet without flinching, who had watched him clear rooms full of hostiles with ice in his veins. Those men had seen him break down completely, sobbing like a child, screaming a name that no longer belonged to anyone alive. His team had formed a circle around him, protecting him from prying eyes, giving him what little privacy they could. One of them, Rodriguez, his best friend for 15 years, had knelt beside him and held him while he cried. They'd stayed like that for almost an hour, and he'd never forgiven Sarah for not waiting. "Your mother called," Thomas said to the headstone, settling into the familiar rhythm of his one-sided conversation. Says she's selling the house in Portland, moving to Florida. She asked if I wanted any of your things. I told her I'd think about it." He paused, watching the rain drip from the brim of his cap. "I don't need things, Ethan. I've got you right here every Sunday." "That's enough for me." But it wasn't enough. It had never been enough. 10 years of standing in cemeteries, 10 years of talking to stone, 10 years of carrying a grief so heavy it had broken his marriage, his career, and very nearly his will to live. Thomas Mercer had survived 3 combat deployments, 2 bullet wounds, and an IED explosion that had left him with a titanium plate in his skull and a permanent ringing in his left ear. He'd been trained to endure things that would break ordinary men, but nothing had prepared him for the death of his child. "I should go," he said finally, the way he always did, the way he'd said it every Sunday for a decade. "Same time next week, okay? I love you, son." He touched the headstone one more time, then turned and walked away through the rain, his limp more pronounced than usual. The cold always made it worse, the old injury from Fallujah, the one that had finally forced him into medical retirement 3 years after Ethan's death. His truck was parked in the same spot it always was, next to the old oak tree at the cemetery entrance. A 2010 Ford F-150, silver, with a faded sealed Trident sticker on the back window. He climbed in, started the engine, and sat there for a long moment, watching the windshield wipers fight a losing battle against the rain. His phone buzzed, a text from his sponsor, Mike. "Meeting tonight at 7. You coming?" Thomas stared at the message. The AA meetings had been court-ordered at first, after the DUI 3 years ago. He'd been driving home from a bar, the 3rd bar that night, when he'd run a red light and nearly killed a family of 4. The father had pulled him out of the truck and beaten him bloody before the cops arrived. Thomas hadn't fought back. Part of him had felt like he deserved it. The judge had given him a choice, jail or rehab. He'd chosen rehab, not because he wanted to get better, but because he couldn't bear the thought of being locked up. In prison, he wouldn't be able to visit Ethan's grave. That Sunday ritual was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. Rehab had been brutal. 30 days of confronting every demon he'd spent years trying to drown. The counselors had pushed him to talk about his son, about his failed marriage, about the guilt that consumed him. He'd resisted at first, then broken down completely, then slowly, painfully, started to rebuild. Mike had been his sponsor since the day he got out. A Vietnam vet, 73 years old, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen things Thomas could only imagine. Mike had served 2 tours in the jungle, come home to a country that spat on him, and spent the next 20 years trying to kill himself with alcohol before finally getting sober. "You remind me of myself," Mike had told Thomas during their first meeting. "All that training, all that discipline, and we still can't fight the one enemy that matters. What enemy is that? Ourselves." Now Thomas went to meetings voluntarily, most of the time. It was better than sitting alone in his apartment, staring at the walls, thinking about all the ways he'd failed. "Yeah," he typed back. "I'll be there." He put the truck in gear and pulled out of the cemetery parking lot, heading toward the small town of Westbrook, Virginia, where he'd lived for the past 8 years. It was a quiet place, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone and strangers stood out like sore thumbs. Thomas had chosen it specifically because it was close to the cemetery, but far enough from his old life that he could pretend to start over. He hadn't started over, of course. He'd just found a different place to be broken. The drive took 20 minutes. Thomas pulled into the parking lot of his apartment complex, a modest 2-story building on the edge of town, and cut the engine. He sat there for another long moment, gathering the energy to move. That's when he saw it. A boy, maybe 15 or 16, walking along the sidewalk across the street. He had dark hair, a lanky build, and a backpack slung over one shoulder. Nothing remarkable, just a kid walking home from somewhere. But something about the way he moved, the slight hitch in his step, the way he kept his head down, the particular angle of his shoulders, made Thomas's heart stutter in his chest. He looked like Ethan. Not just a passing resemblance, not just the way all teenage boys kind of looked alike if you squinted. This kid looked exactly like Ethan had looked at that age, down to the way he shoved his hands in his pockets and the particular tilt of his head when he glanced at something interesting. Thomas felt the air leave his lungs. For a moment he was back in time, watching his son walk home from school. That familiar gait, that familiar posture. He'd picked Ethan up from school exactly once during his entire childhood, a day when Sarah had been sick and Thomas had been home on leave. He'd been so proud, standing outside the school gates, waiting for his son to emerge. Ethan had been embarrassed, of course, the way teenagers get embarrassed about everything their parents do, but he'd also been secretly pleased. Thomas had seen it in his eyes. Those same eyes that this boy seemed to have. Thomas's hand was on the door handle before he realized what he was doing. He stopped himself, breathing hard, fingers trembling. This happened sometimes. He'd see a kid on the street, in a store, at the gas station, and for one heart-stopping moment, he'd think it was Ethan. His mind would play tricks on him, conjuring his son's face onto strangers, giving him hope where there was none. It was never Ethan. It was never going to be Ethan. Ethan was dead. Thomas watched the boy disappear around a corner, then forced himself to get out of the truck and go inside. His apartment was small and sparse, a living room, a bedroom, a kitchen he barely used. The walls were mostly bare, except for a single framed photograph on the bookshelf. Thomas and Ethan at a Nationals game, both of them grinning, their faces smeared with mustard from the hot dogs they'd devoured. Ethan had been 12 in that photo. It was one of the last good memories Thomas had of being a father. A real father, not the absent shadow who showed up between deployments with expensive gifts and guilty smiles. The guilt was always there. Even now, a decade after Ethan's death, Thomas carried it with him like a second skin, all those missed birthdays. All those school plays he'd promised to attend and then cancelled at the last minute when the mission called. All those bedtime stories he'd never told, homework problems he'd never helped solve, scraped knees he'd never bandaged. He tried to make up for it with gifts, expensive toys, the latest video games, trips to Disneyland during his rare leaves. But even a 12-year-old could see through that. Ethan had once told him, during a particularly bad argument, "I don't want your presents, Dad. I just want you." Thomas had promised to be better, had sworn he'd be there more, be present more. And then the next deployment came, and the next, and before he knew it, Ethan was a teenager who barely talked to him, and Sarah was serving him with divorce papers. He'd lost his family long before that car crash. The accident had just made it official. He showered, changed, and made himself a sandwich he didn't taste. Then he sat on the couch and stared at the wall until it was time to leave for the meeting. The AA meeting was held in the basement of St. Michael's Church, a few blocks from the apartment. Thomas walked there despite the rain, because the walk helped clear his head. The streets were quiet at this hour, most of the shops closed, the streetlights casting pale circles on the wet pavement. He was halfway there when he saw the boy again. Same dark hair, same lanky build, same backpack. He was standing outside the hardware store, looking at something in the window display, his reflection ghostly in the glass. Thomas stopped walking. His heart was pounding now, loud enough that he could hear it over the rain. This was crazy. This was absolutely crazy. He was a trained observer, a former SEAL, who had spent years learning to read people, to notice details, to trust his instincts. And his instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong. He studied the boy more carefully this time, cataloguing details the way he'd been trained to do. The shape of his ears, slightly pointed at the top, just like Ethan's. The way he stood with his weight on his left foot, a habit Ethan had developed after spraining his right ankle in a basketball game when he was 13. The particular curve of his jawline, strong and defined, a Mercer family trait that went back generations. Every detail matched. Every single one. Thomas had seen a lot of impossible things in his years as a SEAL. He'd witnessed miracles and horrors in equal measure. He'd learned that the world was stranger and more complicated than most people ever realized. But this was beyond anything he could explain. The boy turned, as if sensing he was being watched. For one frozen moment, their eyes met across the street. Thomas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The boy had Ethan's eyes. Not similar eyes, not eyes that reminded him of Ethan's. Ethan's actual eyes, brown with flecks of gold around the iris, slightly asymmetrical, the right one just a fraction larger than the left. Thomas had memorized those eyes, had looked into them the day Ethan was born, had watched them change from baby blue to that distinctive brown, had seen them light up with joy and cloud with anger and fill with tears when Thomas missed yet another birthday, yet another school play, yet another important moment in his son's life. The boy looked away and walked quickly down the street, disappearing into the evening gloom. Thomas stood there in the rain, shaking. He didn't go to the meeting. Instead, he walked home in a daze, replaying those few seconds over and over in his mind. He told himself he was being ridiculous. He told himself grief did strange things to people, that the mind could convince itself of anything if it wanted badly enough. He told himself that Ethan was dead, had been dead for 10 years, was buried in a cemetery 20 minutes away where Thomas visited him every single week. But he couldn't shake the feeling that had seized him when their eyes met, that feeling of recognition, of connection, of something he'd thought he'd lost forever, suddenly and impossibly present. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Thomas did something he hadn't done in years. He went for a run, not for exercise, not for his health, but because he needed to think, and his tiny apartment was suffocating him. He ran through the quiet streets of Westbrook as the sun came up, his bad leg protesting every step, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He ran past the hardware store where he'd seen the boy, past the church where the AA meetings were held, past the coffee shop and the barber shop and the small park where kids played on the weekends, and then he ran past a house he'd never really noticed before. A modest 2-story at the end of Maple Street, with a neat lawn and a basketball hoop in the driveway. The boy was there. He was shooting baskets in the early morning light, his movements fluid and practiced. Thomas stopped running, his chest heaving, and watched from across the street. The boy noticed him, paused, looked at him with those impossible eyes. "Can I help you?" the boy called out, his voice carrying a note of wariness. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What was he supposed to say? "I think you might be my dead son." He'd sound insane. He probably was insane. "Sorry," he managed finally. You reminded me of someone." The boy's expression shifted, something flickering behind those familiar eyes. "Yeah? Who?" "My son." The words came out before Thomas could stop them. "He died. A long time ago." The boy's face went pale. He lowered the basketball, holding it against his chest like a shield. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. That's really sad." "Yeah." Thomas nodded, already backing away, already regretting this entire encounter. "It is. Sorry to bother you." He turned and walked away as quickly as his leg would allow, feeling the boy's eyes on his back the entire time. What the hell was he doing? What was he hoping to accomplish? The kid was just a kid, a random teenager who happened to bear a passing resemblance to someone who'd been dead for a decade. Thomas was projecting his grief onto a stranger, seeing what he wanted to see instead of what was actually there. He needed to talk to someone. He needed help. He called Mike. "Hey, man," Mike answered on the 3rd ring. "You missed the meeting last night. Everything okay?" "No," Thomas admitted. "I don't think it is." They met at the diner on Main Street, a greasy spoon with bottomless coffee and booths that offered something like privacy. Mike was already there when Thomas arrived, a cup of black coffee in front of him, his weathered face arranged in an expression of patient concern. Mike was a Vietnam vet, 73 years old, 20 years sober. He'd been Thomas's sponsor for the past 2 years, and he was the closest thing Thomas had to a friend. They'd met at Thomas's first AA meeting after rehab, and Mike had taken him under his wing without being asked. That was just the kind of man Mike was. He saw someone struggling, and he helped. "You look like hell," Mike said as Thomas slid into the booth across from him. "Thanks, you always know just what to say." "I'm serious. When's the last time you slept?" Thomas thought about it. "Thursday, maybe? I'm not sure." "That's 3 days ago, Tom." "I know." The waitress came by and Thomas ordered coffee, black like Mike's. He waited until she was gone before speaking. "Tell me what's going on," Mike said. Thomas told him about seeing the boy at the apartment complex, then outside the hardware store, then shooting baskets at the house on Maple Street, about the eyes that looked exactly like Ethan's, about the feeling in his gut that wouldn't go away, no matter how much he told himself it was crazy. He told Mike about the sleepless nights, about the obsessive research, about the way he'd started walking past Maple Street at different times of day, hoping to catch another glimpse of the boy. He knew it sounded insane. He knew Mike might think he'd finally lost his grip on reality, but Mike listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Thomas finished, Mike was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Have you considered the possibility that you might be right?" Thomas blinked. "What? I'm not saying you are. I'm just asking if you've considered it. Ethan is dead. I've been visiting his grave for 10 years. Have you ever seen the body?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No. I was on deployment. By the time I got back, he'd already been buried. Sarah handled everything." "And you've never questioned that? Never asked for details?" "Why would I? The police came to my door. They told me my son was dead. What more detail did I need?" Mike held up his hands. "I'm not trying to upset you, Tom. I'm just saying that sometimes things aren't what they seem. You were a SEAL. You know better than anyone that people can be deceived, that identities can be mistaken, that the truth isn't always what it appears to be." Thomas shook his head. "You're talking about conspiracy theories. This is my son, my ex-wife, the police. I'm talking about possibilities. You said this kid has Ethan's eyes, not similar eyes, Ethan's actual eyes. You said your gut is telling you something. You spent 20 years trusting your gut in life or death situations. Why stop now?" Thomas sat back in the booth, his mind reeling. It was crazy. It was absolutely certifiably crazy. But Mike's question kept echoing in his head. "Have you ever seen the body?" No, he hadn't. He'd been told his son was dead, and he'd believed it. He'd accepted it. He'd spent 10 years grieving a loss he'd never actually witnessed. What if he'd been wrong? "What are you suggesting I do?" Thomas asked slowly. "I'm suggesting you find out the truth, one way or another." Mike took a sip of his coffee. "Because if you're wrong, you can put this to rest and move on. But if you're right..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Thomas spent the next 3 days doing something he should have done a decade ago. Investigating. He started with the accident report. It took some doing, calling in old favors, navigating bureaucratic red tape, dealing with clerks who didn't understand why anyone would want records from a 10-year-old car accident. But eventually, he got what he needed. He also reached out to old contacts from his SEAL days. Rodriguez, his former teammate, now worked for a private security firm with resources Thomas didn't have access to anymore. When Thomas explained what he was looking for, Rodriguez didn't ask questions. He just said, "I'll see what I can find, Ghost. Give me a couple days." That nickname, Ghost, had been given to him during his first deployment. He had a talent for moving silently, for appearing and disappearing without a trace. It had served him well in combat. Now he hoped it would serve him in this different kind of mission. The report was sparse. Single vehicle accident. Rainy night. Driver lost control on a curve, hit a tree. The driver, identified as Ethan James Mercer, age 19, was pronounced dead at the scene. Identification was made through the victim's driver's license and personal effects found in the vehicle. No mention of dental records, no mention of DNA testing, no mention of a family member confirming the identity. The body had been too badly damaged, the report noted. Fire had spread from the engine after impact. The remains had been released to the family for cremation. Cremation. Thomas sat back, staring at the report. Sarah had never mentioned cremation. He'd always assumed, he'd never asked, had been too deep in his own grief to ask, that Ethan had been buried intact, but according to this report there had been nothing left to bury except ashes. So what was in that grave he'd been visiting for 10 years? He called Sarah. She didn't answer the first time or the second. On the third try, she finally picked up, her voice guarded. "Thomas, it's been a while. I need to talk to you about Ethan." Silence on the other end of the line, then, "There's nothing to talk about." "Sarah, please. I just have some questions." "Questions?" Her voice sharpened. "After 10 years, you suddenly have questions. I spent months trying to get you to talk, trying to help you process, and you shut me out. You shut everyone out. And now you want to talk? I know, and I'm sorry. But something happened, and I need to understand." "What happened?" Thomas hesitated. He didn't want to sound crazy. He didn't want to give her ammunition to dismiss him. But he needed answers, and she was the only one who had them. "I think I saw him," he said finally. "Ethan. I think I saw him alive." The silence that followed was so complete, Thomas thought she'd hung up. Then he heard her breathing, ragged and uneven. "That's not possible," she said, but her voice had changed. There was something underneath the denial, something that sounded almost like fear. "Sarah, what happened that night? What really happened?" "He died, Thomas. Our son died. I identified what was left. I made the arrangements. I buried him. There was nothing left to bury. The report says the body was cremated." Another long silence. "I have to go," Sarah said abruptly. "Sarah, please. I can't do this. I can't go through this again. He's gone, Thomas. Let him rest." The line went dead. Thomas stared at the phone in his hand, his heart pounding. She was hiding something. He'd spent enough years interrogating people to recognize the signs, the hesitation, the deflection, the abrupt ending of the conversation when things got too close to the truth. His ex-wife was hiding something about their son's death. The question was, what? He decided to approach the investigation differently. Instead of digging into the past, he would focus on the present, on the boy living 3 blocks away. Over the next week, Thomas learned everything he could about the family on Maple Street. The boy's name was Jack Sullivan. He was 16 years old, a junior at Westbrook High School, a decent student with a talent for basketball, and a small group of close friends. He lived with his mother, Helen Sullivan, a nurse at the local hospital who had moved to Westbrook about 9 years ago. 9 years, 1 year after Ethan's supposed death. Thomas discovered that Helen Sullivan had no known husband, no family in the area, no apparent history before arriving in Westbrook. It was as if she and Jack had simply appeared out of nowhere, with a new life already fully formed. He knew he was becoming obsessed. He knew this wasn't healthy, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when every new piece of information seemed to confirm his suspicions. He needed to talk to the boy, to Jack. He needed to look into those eyes again and ask the questions that were burning a hole in his chest. The opportunity came on a Saturday afternoon. Thomas was sitting in his truck, parked down the street from the Sullivans' house, stalking. A voice in his head whispered, but he ignored it, when he saw Jack leave the house and head toward the park. Thomas followed on foot, keeping his distance, waiting for the right moment. He found Jack sitting alone on a bench near the basketball courts, scrolling through his phone. Thomas approached slowly, his hands visible, trying to look as non-threatening as a 6'2" former SEAL could look. "Hey," he said, "mind if I sit?" Jack looked up, and Thomas saw recognition flash in his eyes. "You're that guy, the one who was watching me last week." "Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I wasn't trying to be creepy. Could have fooled me." Thomas sat down on the far end of the bench, giving the boy plenty of space. "My name's Thomas. Thomas Mercer." Something flickered across Jack's face at the name, too quick to identify. "I'm Jack. I know. I've been asking around about you. I know that sounds weird. It sounds illegal, actually. Thomas couldn't help but smile. The kid had attitude. Ethan had had attitude too. You're right, and I apologize. I've been going through some stuff, and I handled it badly. He took a breath. I told you before that you reminded me of my son. That wasn't entirely true. You don't just remind me of him. You look exactly like him. Exactly. Jack's expression hardened. So what? Lots of people look like other people. Not like this. And there's more. Thomas turned to face him fully. I was a Navy SEAL for 20 years. I was trained to read people, to notice things that other people miss. And everything about you, the way you move, the way you hold yourself, the way you talk, it's all familiar. You don't know me. No, but I'm starting to think I might have, a long time ago. Jack stood abruptly. I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't want to know. Stay away from me, okay? Stop following me. Stop asking about me. Just leave me alone. He started to walk away. Your mother, Thomas called after him. Helen Sullivan. Where did she live before Westbrook? Jack stopped. His shoulders tensed. That's none of your business. Did she ever work as a social worker? In Virginia, maybe? Somewhere near Richmond? Jack turned around slowly. His face had gone pale. How do you know that? Thomas stood, his heart hammering. He'd spent days digging into Helen Sullivan's background, hitting dead ends at every turn. But there had been one small reference, in a decade-old newspaper article about a foster care scandal. A social worker named Helen, who had resigned under unclear circumstances. I know a lot of things, Thomas said carefully. I know you moved here 9 years ago. I know your mother has no family, no history, no connections to this area. I know she changed her name, probably more than once. And I know that you're not who you think you are. Jack was shaking now. You don't know anything? Then tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you have baby pictures. Tell me you remember your life before Westbrook. Tell me your mother talks about your father, about where you came from, about anything from before you were 7 years old. The boy's face crumpled. Just for a moment, the tough facade cracked, and Thomas saw something underneath that looked a lot like terror. I have to go, Jack whispered, and then he was gone, running across the park and disappearing into the evening shadows. Thomas didn't follow. He'd pushed too hard, moved too fast, but he'd also confirmed something important. Jack didn't have any memories from before he was 7 years old. The age Ethan would have been if he'd been taken instead of killed. Thomas barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ethan's face. Not the 19-year-old face he'd preserved in memory, but Ethan as a child. 7 years old, frightened, confused, suddenly in the care of a stranger who told him he had a new name, a new life, a new mother. The thought made Thomas physically sick. In the morning, he did something he'd been avoiding for a decade. He called the detective who had handled Ethan's case. Detective Martinez had retired 5 years ago, but Thomas tracked him down to a fishing cabin in Maryland. The old cop was surprised to hear from him, but not unwilling to talk. The Mercer case, Martinez said, his voice heavy with the weight of memory. Yeah, I remember it. Kid died in a car crash. Father was overseas. Mother handled everything. Seemed pretty straightforward. Did you actually investigate? Or did you just accept what you were told? A pause. What are you getting at, Mercer? I'm getting at the fact that there was no body, no DNA identification, no family confirmation, just a driver's license and some personal effects. The body was badly burned. Identification wasn't possible through normal means. But you didn't question it, didn't find it strange that a 19-year-old kid just 3 months out of high school would be driving alone on a rainy night on a road he'd never used before. Another pause, longer this time. The mother was very convincing, and she was grieving. You don't push a grieving mother too hard. What if the mother was lying? Why would she lie about her own son's death? Thomas had been asking himself that question for days. Why would Sarah lie? What possible reason could she have for faking Ethan's death, for taking him away, for making Thomas believe for 10 years that his son was gone forever? And then it hit him. The custody battle. When Thomas and Sarah had divorced, Ethan had been 6. The custody arrangement had been contentious. Thomas was deployed most of the time, which gave Sarah a strong argument for primary custody. But Thomas had fought hard for joint custody for meaningful time with his son. He'd won. Over Sarah's strenuous objections, the judge had granted him shared custody, with Ethan spending summers and holidays with Thomas when he wasn't deployed. Sarah had been furious. She'd never said so directly, but Thomas had sensed it. The resentment, the belief that Thomas didn't deserve time with Ethan when he was absent so often, the conviction that she would be a better parent on her own. What if she'd decided to make that conviction a reality? What if she'd staged the accident, faked Ethan's death, and disappeared with their son to start a new life somewhere Thomas would never find them? It was monstrous. It was unthinkable. But it was also, Thomas realized with growing horror, entirely possible. He called Sarah again. This time she didn't answer. He called 12 more times over the next 2 days. Nothing. Finally, on the 3rd day, a text appeared on his phone. "Stop calling. Stop investigating. You don't know what you're getting into." Thomas stared at the message, his blood running cold. It wasn't a denial, it wasn't an explanation. It was a warning. His ex-wife was warning him away from the truth. That was all the confirmation he needed. Thomas spent the next week building his case. He collected everything he'd found: the accident report, the newspaper article, his observations about Jack, the timeline that showed Helen Sullivan appearing in Westbrook exactly 1 year after Ethan's death. He organized it all into a folder, creating a dossier that would have made his old intelligence officers proud. Then he went to see Helen Sullivan. She answered the door on the 3rd knock, her face pale and drawn. She was a small woman with tired eyes and grey-streaked hair, and she looked at Thomas with an expression that mixed fear with something else. Resignation, he realized. She'd been expecting him. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I wondered when you'd come. You know who I am. I've known for years. I recognized you the first time I saw you in town 8 years ago. I almost moved again. But Jack had finally started to settle in, and I couldn't do that to him again." Thomas's heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear his own voice. "So it's true. Jack is Ethan." Helen's face crumpled. She stepped back from the door, a silent invitation to enter. The house was modest but comfortable. Thomas followed Helen into the living room, where photographs lined the walls. Photographs of Jack at various ages, Jack playing basketball, Jack at the beach, Jack smiling on Christmas morning. Photographs of his son, living the life Thomas had been denied. Thomas studied each one, his heart breaking and healing simultaneously. There was Jack at maybe 8 years old, missing his 2 front teeth, holding up a fish he'd caught. Jack at 10, dressed in a basketball uniform, looking serious and determined. Jack at 12, blowing out birthday candles, surrounded by friends Thomas didn't recognize. These were the moments he'd missed, the birthdays, the holidays, the ordinary days that added up to a childhood. While Thomas had been standing at a gravestone, talking to nothing, his son had been here 3 blocks away, growing up without him. "I need you to understand something," Helen said, lowering herself into a chair. Her hands were trembling, and Thomas could see the weight of 9 years of guilt pressing down on her shoulders. "What I did to save him." "Save him from what?" "From me?" "From her." Thomas went still. "Sarah? She came to me 9 years ago. I was working for Child Protective Services in Richmond. She had a boy with her, a beautiful boy, about 7 years old, with the saddest eyes I'd ever seen. She said she needed to disappear, said her ex-husband was dangerous, that he'd hurt the boy if he ever got his hands on him. She said the boy's father was a trained killer, that he had connections everywhere, that the only way to keep her son safe was to make everyone believe he was dead. Thomas felt like he was going to be sick. "She told you I was dangerous, that I would hurt my own son." She was very convincing. She had documentation. Medical records showing injuries she claimed you'd caused, police reports from domestic disturbance calls that were later dismissed. testimony from neighbors who claimed they'd seen you lose your temper. She painted a picture of a violent, unstable man who was one bad day away from destroying his family. Those reports were fabricated. I would never. I know that now. I've known for years. Helen's voice broke. But at the time, I believed her. I believed every word. And you believed the evidence? The medical records, the police reports? I believed the little boy who flinched every time someone raised their voice. I believed a mother who was terrified enough to burn her entire life to the ground to protect her child. Thomas closed his eyes, the weight of the revelation crushing him. Sarah had lied. She'd constructed an elaborate fiction, used his military career against him, twisted his service into something sinister, and Helen had believed every word. "So you helped her fake his death," Thomas said flatly. "I helped her create a new identity. The accident was her idea. She knew someone, she said, who could make it look real. I just took the boy, took care of him while she finished setting things up, and then I was supposed to hand him over, but what?" Helen's eyes filled with tears. "She never came back. She called once, about a month after the accident, and said her plans had changed, said she'd realized she couldn't be a mother anymore, not after everything she'd been through, asked if I would take care of him, raise him as my own. And you agreed. I loved him by then. How could I not? He was such a sweet boy, so confused and hurt and desperate for someone to tell him everything was going to be okay. I couldn't just abandon him, so I changed my name, moved across the country and started over." Thomas opened his eyes. "Did you ever consider that Sarah might have been lying, that I might not be the monster she described?" "Of course I did, especially after I saw you, living in the same town, and you seemed so normal. Sad and broken, yes, but not dangerous, not violent." Helen wiped her eyes, but by then it was too late. Jack had a life here. He was happy, or as happy as he could be. How could I tell him that everything he knew was a lie? That his mother had abandoned him, his father wasn't really dead, and the woman who raised him had been complicit in the whole deception. So you said nothing. I said nothing, and I've hated myself for it every single day. Thomas sat in silence, processing everything he'd just learned. His ex-wife had stolen his son, faked his death, and abandoned him with a stranger. And that stranger had spent the past 9 years raising Ethan Jack as her own, while Thomas grieved at an empty grave 3 blocks away. The injustice of it was staggering. The cruelty was almost beyond comprehension. But underneath the anger and the betrayal, one thought kept rising to the surface, drowning out everything else. Ethan was alive. His son was alive. "Does he know?" Thomas asked finally. "Does Jack know anything about his real identity?" Helen shook her head. "He was so young when it happened, 7 years old. He had nightmares for years, terrible nightmares about fire and screaming and a man in uniform who never came home. But the memories faded over time. Now he just thinks his father died in the military, that his mother was too grief-stricken to raise him, that I adopted him as a baby. You've been lying to him his whole life. I've been protecting him, the same way I thought I was protecting him when I took him in." Thomas stood abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. He paced the length of the room, his hands clenched into fists, his mind racing. "I need to talk to him. I know you do. And I think he needs to talk to you too." "What do you mean?" Helen stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street. "He's been different since you first approached him, asking questions, looking through old boxes. He found a photograph I'd kept, a photograph of a man in a Navy uniform, holding a baby." Thomas's breath caught. Ethan's baby picture. "With me, I should have thrown it away, but I couldn't. It seemed wrong somehow, like erasing the last proof that his real life had ever existed." She turned to face him. "He showed me the picture last night, asked me who the man was. I couldn't lie anymore, not after everything." "What did you tell him?" "The truth. All of it." Thomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "How did he take it?" He ran out of the house, didn't come back until midnight. When he did, he didn't say a word to me. Just went straight to his room and shut the door. Helen's voice broke. I don't know if he'll ever forgive me, but I know he needs to meet you, to hear your side of the story, to understand who his father really is. Where is he now? At school. But he should be home in about an hour. Thomas nodded, decision crystallizing in his mind. I'll wait. The hour was the longest of Thomas's life. He sat in Helen's living room, surrounded by photographs of his son's stolen childhood, and tried to prepare himself for the conversation to come. What do you say to the child you thought was dead? How do you explain a decade of grief, of empty Sunday mornings at a gravestone, of a life that stopped making sense the moment 2 police officers showed up at your door? He heard the front door open at exactly 3:30. Footsteps in the hallway. Then silence. Jack appeared in the doorway of the living room. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, his posture tense with a mixture of fear and defiance. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. She told you, Jack said finally. It wasn't a question. Yes. And you believe her? That I'm... Yes. Thomas's voice cracked. I know it sounds crazy. I know this whole situation is impossible. But I've spent the last month investigating, putting pieces together, and everything points to the same conclusion. You're my son, my Ethan, and I've spent 10 years believing you were dead. Jack's face crumpled, the tough facade finally shattering completely. I don't remember you. I've tried. Ever since Mom, Helen, told me the truth, I've been trying to remember something, anything from before. But there's nothing, just fragments, feelings. What kind of feelings? Safe. I remember feeling safe and happy. Jack's voice was barely a whisper. And then one day everything was scary and confusing and wrong, and there was a woman telling me my name was Jack now, and I had to forget everything I used to be. Thomas stood slowly, giving Jack time to retreat if he wanted to. But the boy didn't move. He just stood there, tears streaming down his face, looking impossibly young and impossibly lost. I never stopped loving you, Thomas said, his own tears falling freely now. Not for one single day. Even when I thought you were gone, I carried you with me. Every morning, every night, every moment in between. You were always with me. Jack let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. That's what Mum used to say, my real Mum. She'd say that Daddy loved me so much that even when he was far away, his love was always right there in my heart. She said that. Yeah, before... Jack's face hardened. Before she decided to throw me away. The bitterness in his voice cut Thomas to the bone. But underneath it, he heard something else. Pain, confusion, a desperate need to understand. I can't explain what your mother did, Thomas said carefully. I don't understand it myself. What I can tell you is that I never stopped looking for you, even though I didn't know I should be looking. Every Sunday for 10 years, I went to your grave and talked to you. Told you about my week, brought you presents, said goodbye, even though it killed me every single time. Because you're my son, Ethan. You always were, and you always will be. My name is Jack now. It can be whatever you want it to be. I'm not here to force you to be someone you don't remember being. I'm just here to tell you the truth, and to ask if maybe someday we could try to get to know each other again. Jack was quiet for a long time. Thomas could see him processing, wrestling with emotions he probably couldn't even name. I don't know if I can do this, Jack said finally. That's okay. I mean, you're basically a stranger. You might be my biological father, but I don't know you. I don't know anything about you, except that you were in the military, and you've been living 3 blocks away this whole time. I know, and you're right. I am a stranger, but I'd like to change that, if you're willing. Jack looked at him, really looked, with those impossible eyes that Thomas had memorized before the boy could even walk. Maybe, he said slowly, maybe we could start with something small, like coffee or something. Thomas felt hope bloom in his chest, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably present. Coffee sounds good. They went to the diner on Main Street. the same one where Thomas had met with Mike. They sat in a booth by the window, ordered coffee, black for Thomas, loaded with cream and sugar for Jack, and began the slow, awkward process of learning each other. The first few minutes were painful. Long silences punctuated by awkward attempts at small talk, the clinking of spoons against coffee cups, the weight of 10 lost years sitting between them like an uninvited guest. But slowly, gradually, the conversation started to flow. Thomas talked about his years in the SEALs, not the classified parts, not the darkness, but the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the brothers he'd served with, and the places he'd seen. He told Jack about the time his team got stranded in the desert for 3 days and survived on protein bars and sheer stubbornness. About the practical jokes they'd play on each other during long deployments. About Rodriguez, who had been his best friend for 2 decades, and who Thomas still called every month just to check in. Jack talked about school, about basketball, about his friends and his dreams of maybe going to college someday. He talked about his favorite teachers and his least favorite subjects, and the girl in his chemistry class who he might have a crush on but wasn't sure yet. They discovered they both loved the Nationals, both hated mushrooms, both had a weakness for action movies and a secret appreciation for cheesy 80s music. "Wait, you actually like Hall & Oates?" Jack asked, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What's wrong with Hall & Oates?" "Nothing, I play them in my room sometimes and my friends give me so much grief about it." Thomas laughed, a real laugh, one that came from somewhere deep inside. "Your mom used to tease me about the same thing, said I was born in the wrong decade." Jack's expression flickered at the mention of his mother, his real mother, Sarah, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he asked, "What else did she say about you?" And so Thomas told him about meeting Sarah at a college party, about their whirlwind romance, about the wedding on the beach with his SEAL team serving as groomsmen, about the day Ethan was born, when Thomas had held his tiny son in his massive hands and felt terrified and overjoyed in equal measure. "I was so scared," Thomas admitted. "I'd faced down-armed insurgents without breaking a sweat, but this little baby absolutely terrified me. I had no idea how to be a father." "Did you figure it out?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Not really. I tried. I failed a lot. I was gone too much. But I loved you, loved him. I loved Ethan with everything I had. That part I got right." Jack looked down at his coffee cup. "He sounds like a good dad. Better than what I grew up thinking." "What did they tell you about me?" "That you died. That you were killed in combat before I was born. That my mother was so grief-stricken she couldn't take care of me, so Helen took me in." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest. Not at Jack, never at Jack, but at the people who had crafted this elaborate lie. "None of that is true. I know that now, but for 9 years it was my whole history, my whole identity. It's hard to just let go of that." "You don't have to let go of anything. You can be Jack and Ethan. You can be whoever you want to be. I'm not here to take anything away from you. I just want to be part of your life in whatever way you'll let me." Jack looked up, those impossible eyes meeting Thomas's. "That's what Helen said you'd say. She said if you were really the monster my birth mother claimed you were, you wouldn't be this patient, this understanding. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. Being impatient with you isn't going to be one of them." They were different people now than they'd been 10 years ago. Thomas hardened by grief and Jack shaped by a childhood of lies. But underneath the differences, there was a connection, a familiarity that couldn't be explained by shared DNA alone. It was a start. The next few months were complicated. Helen moved out of the house on Maple Street, unable to face the consequences of her deception. She found an apartment on the other side of town and sent Jack monthly letters that he sometimes read and sometimes threw away unopened. Thomas and Jack met regularly, coffee at the diner, basketball at the park, long drives through the countryside where they could talk without the pressure of sitting face to face. Each meeting was a small victory, a tiny step toward rebuilding what had been stolen. There were setbacks too, Days when Jack was angry and withdrawn, unable to reconcile his two identities. Days when Thomas pushed too hard or not hard enough, still learning how to be a father to a teenager he barely knew. Days when the weight of the lost years felt crushing, and both of them wondered if the effort was worth it. But they kept trying. That was the thing about Mercers. They didn't quit. Thomas started attending Jack's basketball games. He'd sit in the bleachers wearing a Westbrook Wolves t-shirt he'd bought at the school store and cheer until his voice was hoarse. At first, Jack seemed embarrassed by his presence, but gradually Thomas noticed him glancing toward the stands after making a good play, looking for that familiar face in the crowd. They started having dinner together once a week. Jack would come to Thomas's apartment and they'd order pizza or Chinese food and watch whatever game was on TV. Sometimes they talked about important things: Jack's feelings about his birth mother, Thomas's guilt about being absent, their hopes and fears for the future. Other times they just sat in comfortable silence, two people learning how to share space again. Thomas got a lawyer and began the process of legally establishing his parental rights. It was messy and expensive and emotionally exhausting, but he was determined to do things right. Jack, Ethan, deserved to have his identity back, even if he chose to keep using his adopted name. The court case dragged on for months. Thomas had to provide DNA evidence, testimony from witnesses who knew him before Ethan's death, documentation proving that he'd never been the violent, dangerous man Sarah had claimed. The judge was thorough, understandably so, given the unusual circumstances. But in the end, the evidence was overwhelming. Thomas was declared Ethan's legal father, with all the rights that entailed. Jack watched the court proceedings with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Afterward, in the parking lot, he said, "So, you're officially my dad now. I was always your dad. Now it's just on paper. Does that mean I have to start calling you Dad?" Thomas smiled. "You can call me whatever you want, kid." "I'll think about it, Tom." Thomas laughed. "Fair enough." And Sarah disappeared. Completely and utterly vanished, as if she'd never existed. Thomas hired a private investigator to track her down, but the trail went cold somewhere in South America. Part of him wanted answers. Part of him wanted justice. But a bigger part of him just wanted to focus on the son he'd gotten back. The first time Jack called him Dad, they were at a Nationals game. Upper deck, terrible seats, hot dogs that cost way too much. The home team was losing badly, and Jack was complaining about the umpire's vision, and Thomas was laughing at his outrage. And then Jack said, "Come on, Dad, tell me I'm wrong." And everything stopped. Jack froze, as if surprised by his own words. Thomas felt tears spring to his eyes. It had been 2 years since the reunion, 2 years of slow progress and occasional setbacks, 2 years of rebuilding a relationship that had been stolen from them. And in all that time, Jack had never called him Dad. Tom sometimes, Mr. Mercer when he was being formal, hey or you, or just a pointed look when he wanted Thomas's attention, but never Dad. The word hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. "You're wrong," Thomas managed to say, his voice thick. That was clearly a strike. Jack grinned, the tension breaking. "No way! That was a mile outside." And just like that, they were back to normal, or whatever passed for normal in their strange new relationship. But the word had been spoken. The barrier had been crossed. And from that day forward, Thomas noticed Jack using it more and more often. Casually at first, as if testing it out. Then, more naturally, as if he'd been saying it his whole life. Dad. Such a simple word. Such an ordinary thing for a son to call his father. But to Thomas, it meant everything. The 1-year anniversary of their reunion fell on a Sunday. Thomas woke early, as he always did, and made his usual drive to the cemetery, but this time he wasn't alone. Jack sat in the passenger seat of the truck, quiet and nervous. He'd asked to come, said he wanted to see the grave that Thomas had visited for so long, said he needed to understand what his father had gone through. They parked in the usual spot, under the old oak tree. walked together through the rows of headstones until they reached the small marker bearing Ethan James Mercer's name. Thomas stood there, looking at the stone that had been his anchor and his torment for so many years. He remembered all the Sunday mornings, all the one-sided conversations, all the tears shed in this very spot. He remembered the rage and the despair and the bottomless grief that had nearly destroyed him. Jack stood beside him, quiet and respectful. He was looking at the headstone with a strange expression, part curiosity, part sorrow, part something that might have been guilt. "It's weird," Jack said finally, "seeing my name on a grave. It's not your name anymore, not unless you want it to be." "I know, but it was, once." He reached out and touched the cold stone. "Do you think there's actually someone buried here, or is it just empty?" Thomas had wondered the same thing. He'd done some research, made some inquiries. The funeral home that had handled the arrangements had gone out of business years ago, and their records had been lost. There was no way to know for sure. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I like to think there's someone here, someone who deserves to be remembered, even if nobody knows their real name." Jack nodded slowly. "That's a nice thought." Then Thomas knelt down and began removing the offerings he'd left over the years, the model airplanes, the baseballs, the books and photographs. Each item held a memory, a moment of grief transformed into an act of love. He gathered them carefully, placing them in a bag he'd brought for this purpose. "What are you doing?" Jack asked. "Letting go," Thomas said. "I don't need this anymore. You're not here, you never were." Jack knelt beside him, helping to gather the items. When they were done, Thomas pulled out a small American flag, the kind you see at military funerals, and placed it at the base of the stone. "This isn't for you," he said quietly, addressing the grave. "This is for whoever's actually here, for the family who lost someone and never got the recognition they deserved. I'm sorry I took that from you." He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. Jack stood beside him. "So what happens now?" Jack asked. Thomas looked at his son, his living, breathing son, with those impossible eyes and that stubborn jaw and all the years ahead of them. "Now we go home," he said, "and we start living." They walked back to the truck together, leaving the empty grave behind. Thomas didn't look back. 5 years later, the journey from that cemetery visit to this moment had been long and winding. Jack had finished high school with honors, earned a football scholarship to the Naval Academy, a choice that had made Thomas prouder than he'd ever been, and grown into a young man who combined the best of both his identities. He'd legally changed his name during his freshman year of college. Jack Ethan Mercer. A bridge between who he'd been and who he was becoming. Thomas had cried when Jack told him, though he'd tried to hide it. Jack had pretended not to notice. There had been difficult moments along the way. A period during Jack's senior year of high school when he'd become obsessed with finding Sarah, convinced that he needed to confront her to find closure. Thomas had helped him search, even though every instinct screamed that Sarah didn't deserve their attention. They'd never found her. And eventually, Jack had made peace with that uncertainty. There had been a girlfriend, a sweet girl named Maya, who Jack had met during his sophomore year of college. She'd been skeptical at first when Jack told her his incredible story, but she'd come to accept it and eventually to embrace it. Thomas liked her. She was good for Jack, kept him grounded, reminded him that life wasn't all about the past, and there had been Thomas's own healing. He'd stayed sober, kept going to meetings, rebuilt his life one day at a time. He'd reconnected with old friends, started volunteering at a veterans organization, even adopted a dog, a retired military working dog named Duke, who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before being retired due to a leg injury. Duke was getting old now, grey around the muzzle, sleeping more than he used to. But he still perked up whenever Jack came to visit, still remembered the young man who had helped Thomas bring him home from the shelter 5 years ago. The stadium was packed for the Navy versus Army game, one of the oldest rivalries in college football. Thomas sat in the stands, wearing his old Navy cap, surrounded by thousands of screaming fans. Rodriguez was beside him. They'd reconnected after Thomas had called him for help with the investigation, and their friendship had grown stronger than ever. Rodriguez had retired from the private security firm and now spent his time fishing and spoiling his grandchildren, but he never missed one of Jack's games. "Remember when we used to be the ones everyone was cheering for?" Rodriguez shouted over the crowd noise. "That was a long time ago, brother. Not that long. I can still outrun you. In your dreams." They laughed. The easy camaraderie of men who had faced death together and come out the other side. But Thomas only had eyes for one player, number 22, wide receiver. Jack Mercer, he'd legally changed his name 2 years ago, had just caught a 40-yard pass and was streaking down the sideline toward the end zone. Thomas was on his feet before he knew it, screaming along with everyone else, his heart pounding with a father's pride and a father's terror. He'd watched every game of Jack's college career, traveled to every stadium, worn out countless Navy caps. But it never got easier, watching his son take hits from players twice his size. "He's got it!" Rodriguez yelled. "He's going all the way!" Jack crossed into the end zone. Touchdown! The crowd erupted. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face, but he didn't care. Rodriguez was hugging him, pounding his back, and strangers around them were high-fiving and cheering. His son had just scored on national television in front of 100,000 fans and a national audience. His son, who had been dead for 10 years. His son, who had been living 3 blocks away. His son, who had found his way back to him against all odds. After the game, Navy won 31-24, Thomas waited outside the locker room. It took forever for Jack to emerge, surrounded by teammates and coaches and reporters wanting to talk about his game-winning catch. But when Jack finally spotted Thomas in the crowd, he pushed through everyone to get to him. "Dad!" He threw his arms around Thomas, lifting him off the ground in an exuberant hug. "Did you see it? Did you see that catch?" "I saw it," Thomas laughed, hugging him back. "I've never been more proud in my entire life. Coach says there might be scouts from the NFL. Can you believe it? The NFL. I believe it. You've worked hard for this." Jack pulled back, his face glowing with joy and exhaustion. "Thanks for being here, Dad. I know it's a long drive. I wouldn't miss it for the world." And he wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. He'd already missed 10 years. He wasn't going to miss another minute. That night, Thomas drove home to Westbrook. His apartment had gotten a little bigger over the years. He'd moved into a 2-bedroom so Jack would have a place to stay during visits. But it was still modest, still sparse, still the home of a man who'd spent most of his life not really living. But things had changed. Duke greeted him at the door, tail wagging slowly, as if he'd been waiting all day for Thomas to come home. The kitchen actually got used now. Thomas had learned to cook, simple meals mostly, but real food instead of sandwiches he didn't taste. And the living room had transformed from a bare, lonely space into something that felt almost like a home. On the bookshelf, next to the old photograph of Thomas and Ethan at the Nationals game, there were new pictures now. Jack's high school graduation, his first college football game, the 2 of them at the Grand Canyon, on the road trip they'd taken the summer after the reunion. A snapshot of Jack with Maya, both of them laughing at something off camera. Duke as a puppy, or as close to a puppy as a retired military dog ever got. Rodriguez and his family at the barbecue Thomas had hosted last 4th of July. Evidence of a life being lived, of time being made up, of a family being rebuilt, one moment at a time. Thomas sat down in his favorite chair, Duke settling at his feet with a contented sigh, and looked at those photographs. He thought about the decade he'd lost, the years of grief and emptiness, and Sunday mornings spent talking to stone. He thought about Sarah, wherever she was, and whether she ever regretted what she'd done. He thought about Helen, who still sent Jack letters that he sometimes answered now, tentative steps toward forgiveness that might never fully come, but were steps nonetheless. And he thought about Ethan, about the boy he'd been and the man he was becoming, about the strange twist of fate that had put them in the same small town for 8 years without either of them knowing, about the moment when their eyes had met across a rain-slicked street and Thomas's life had changed forever. His phone buzzed. A text from Jack. "Hey, Dad. Made it back to campus safe. Thanks again for coming. Love you." Thomas smiled and typed back, "Love you too, son. To the moon and back." A moment later, to the stars and beyond. Their old ritual restored. Their old connection renewed. Jack had asked about it once during one of their early coffee meetings. Where did that phrase come from? Thomas had explained that it was something he'd made up when Ethan was a baby, a bedtime ritual that had evolved over years of whispered goodnights and long-distance phone calls. "I don't remember it," Jack had admitted, "but it feels familiar somehow, like a song you've heard but can't quite place." "Memories are weird like that," Thomas had replied. "Sometimes they hide in places we don't expect." Now 5 years later, the ritual had become theirs again. Every phone call ended with it. Every text message. Every visit. It was a bridge across the lost years. A reminder of what they'd been and what they could be again. Thomas set down the phone and closed his eyes. Duke shifted at his feet, letting out a small whine in his sleep, dreaming of whatever retired military dogs dream of. The apartment was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of traffic. For the first time in 15 years, he felt something that had seemed impossible for so long: peace. He'd spent 10 years crying at his son's grave, not knowing Ethan was alive and living just 3 blocks away. It was a decade of stolen time, of unnecessary grief, of a cruelty he still couldn't fully comprehend. Sometimes, late at night, Thomas still thought about Sarah, wondered where she was, what she was doing, whether she ever thought about the son she'd abandoned. He'd made peace with the fact that he might never get answers. Some questions didn't have answers, and some wounds never fully healed. But he'd also learned that you could live with wounds. You could carry them with you, let them become part of who you were, without letting them define you. The scars on his body told stories of battles survived. The scars on his heart told a different kind of story, one of loss and grief and ultimately redemption. Mike had passed away 2 years ago, a heart attack, peaceful in his sleep. Thomas had spoken at the funeral, told stories about the man who had saved his life without ever picking up a weapon. He still went to AA meetings, still shared his story with newcomers, still passed on what Mike had taught him. "We don't get to choose what happens to us," Mike used to say, "but we get to choose how we respond. That's where the power is." Thomas had chosen to respond with hope, with persistence, with the stubborn refusal to give up that had been drilled into him during SEAL training. And it had led him here to this moment, to this life he'd never expected to have. But the story didn't end at the grave. It ended here, in this modest apartment, with photographs on the shelf and a phone full of text messages and a son who called him Dad. It ended with hope, with healing, with the slow, painful, beautiful work of building a life out of the wreckage. Thomas Mercer had survived wars and injuries and a grief that nearly destroyed him. He'd been a ghost, a shell, a man going through the motions of living without ever really being alive. But not anymore. Now he was a father again, and that made all the difference. The rain was falling outside, the same kind of rain that had fallen on all those Sunday mornings at the cemetery. But Thomas didn't mind the rain anymore. It wasn't a symbol of loss and grief. It was just rain, nature doing what nature did, indifferent to human sorrow and human joy alike. Duke stirred at his feet, letting out a soft whine. Thomas reached down and scratched behind his ears, the way the dog liked. "Good boy," he murmured. "We made it, didn't we? Both of us." Duke had his own story of loss and recovery. 3 tours in Afghanistan, searching for explosives, saving countless lives. Then an IED had taken his leg, and he'd been retired, sent to a shelter where he'd waited for someone to give him a second chance. Thomas understood that kind of waiting. The endless days, wondering if anyone would ever come. if life would ever get better, if there was anything worth hoping for. And tomorrow, the sun would come out. And the day after that, Jack would call to tell him about practice. And the week after that, they'd meet for coffee at the diner on Main Street. And the month after that, Thomas would drive to another football game, wearing his navy cap, cheering until his voice gave out. Life went on. That was the lesson Thomas had learned in these past 5 years. No matter how dark things got, no matter how much you lost, life found a way to go on. You just had to be brave enough to let it. He opened his eyes and looked out the window at the rain. Somewhere out there, 3 blocks away, was the house where his son had grown up without him. Somewhere further, across the state, was the cemetery where he'd spent a decade mourning a lie. But here, in this apartment, surrounded by evidence of the life he'd rebuilt, Thomas Mercer finally felt at home. His son was alive. His son loved him. His son was out there in the world, chasing dreams and building a future. And Thomas would be there for every step of it, every victory and every defeat, every joy and every sorrow, every moment, big and small, that made up a life. Because that's what fathers do. They show up, they stay, they love, even when it hurts, and they never, ever give up. The rain continued to fall, and Thomas continued to watch it, and somewhere in the distance, a car splashed through a puddle, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Life went on, and for the first time in a very long time, Thomas was grateful to be part of it.